When the empire began to win its wars again, it started to fear the man who was winning them. There was no betrayal, no rebellion, no banners raised against the throne, and no armies marching on the capital. What happened was quieter than that, slower, and much harder to notice. It was the moment when power stopped trusting even its most loyal servants, not because they were disloyal, but because they were effective. Because an empire can survive external enemies for generations, fighting them, adapting to them, learning from them, but it rarely survives depending on someone, depending on one man, depending on one general. Belisarius did not fall because of ambition, he did not fall because he wanted too much, and he did not fall because he challenged authority. He fell because the empire could no longer afford to believe that anyone could still save it. And when a system reaches that point, when competence itself becomes dangerous, history no longer offers many exits. It offers delay. It offers silence. It offers the slow movement toward collapse. Not because collapse was inevitable in that moment, but because from there on, every choice would only slow it down, never stop it. Belisarius did not rise in a moment of chaos. He rose in a system that still believed it was in control. The Eastern Roman Empire, what we now call Byzantium, had survived when the West had collapsed. Its cities still functioned. Its laws still mattered. Its emperors still ruled from marble halls, not from ruins. From the outside, it looked like stability. From the inside, it was something else. The empire was surrounded by enemies it could no longer fully defeat, and sustained by institutions it no longer fully trusted. Power had become careful, suspicious, defensive. What it needed was not a conqueror. It needed a fixer. Someone who could win wars without changing the balance of power. Someone who could restore order without demanding recognition. Someone who could be effective without becoming indispensable. Belisarius seemed perfect. He was not born into the old aristocracy. He did not come from a legendary family line. He had no political faction behind him, no personal army loyal only to his name. What he had was discipline, precision, and an unusual ability to obey. He followed orders exactly as given. He did not improvise publicly. He did not seek glory in speeches or symbols. He let victories speak for themselves. For an empire that feared ambition more than defeat, this made him acceptable. At first. Under Emperor Justinian, the goal was not expansion for its own sake, it was restoration. The idea that the empire could reclaim what had been lost, not by changing what it was, but by proving that it had never truly fallen. Belisarius was sent where failure was expected, against enemies who outnumbered him, with armies that were smaller, underfunded, and politically inconvenient. And again he succeeded. Not with overwhelming force, but with restraint. He negotiated when others would have slaughtered. He withdrew when others would have chased glory. He preserved cities instead of burning them, populations instead of punishing them. Each victory made the empire safer, and each victory made Belisarius more visible. That was the contradiction. Because the system rewarded results but feared reliance. It needed competence, but only in controlled doses. It wanted success, but not someone who embodied it too clearly. Belisarius never crossed a line. He never claimed power. He never questioned authority. But slowly, without intending to, he became something dangerous. Not an enemy, a solution. And solutions in fragile systems are often treated as threats. Because once a system depends on one man to function, it reveals how close it already is to failure. Belisarius was not aware of this. He believed he was serving the empire. The empire was beginning to realize it was being exposed. Belisarius's success did not come from overwhelming force. It came from control. In an age where victory was often measured by destruction, he achieved results through restraint. He fought carefully. He moved slowly. He chose when not to fight as deliberately as when to engage. This made him effective, and it made him different. While other commanders burned cities to prove dominance, Belisarius preserved them. While others chased decisive battles, he avoided unnecessary risks. He understood that holding territory mattered more than dramatic victories. To the soldiers under his command, this inspired loyalty. To the populations he governed, it created stability. But to the imperial system, it introduced a problem. Belisarius was winning without fitting the traditional image of a conqueror. He was succeeding without spectacle. His authority did not come from fear or charisma, but from reliability. That kind of authority is quiet, and quiet authority spreads. Each campaign reinforced his reputation, not as a rebel, not as a rival, but as someone who could be trusted to succeed where others failed. That trust was personal, and that was dangerous, because systems like Byzantium were designed to trust offices, not individuals. Positions could be replaced, titles could be revoked, but personal credibility was harder to control. Belisarius never tried to leverage this. He did not turn his victories into political capital. He did not seek influence at court. He did not surround himself with loyalists beyond the necessities of command. He remained outwardly the perfect servant, but the effect of his actions could not be contained. The more territory he stabilized, the more visible he became. The more reliable he proved, the more the empire leaned on him, and leaning creates imbalance. Imperial officials began to notice patterns. When Belisarius was present, problems were solved. When he was absent, they returned. This was not resentment, it was arithmetic. If one man consistently produces results, the system must either replicate him or limit him. Replication was impossible. Limitation was not. The victories continued, but the response changed. Praise became formal. Recognition became cautious. Assignments became more narrowly defined, not because Belisarius had failed, but because he had succeeded too consistently. In fragile systems, consistency is not reassuring, it is revealing. It exposes weaknesses that authority would rather keep hidden. It suggests that competence is scarce, that success is not evenly distributed, that the system's stability may depend on exceptions rather than rules. Belisarius was becoming an exception, and exceptions make institutions uncomfortable. Still, there was no confrontation, no accusation, no decisive moment, only a gradual recalibration. The empire did not move against him, it adjusted around him, and Belisarius, loyal as ever, continued to do his job. He followed orders, he completed objectives, he withdrew when told to withdraw. He believed this balance could hold. He believed effectiveness was still protection. He did not yet understand that his rise had already changed the terms. That victory, once achieved too many times, stops being a solution and starts becoming a question the system cannot afford to answer. By the time Belisarius's victories accumulated, the problem was no longer military. It was structural. The empire had achieved what it wanted, stability in territories it had expected to lose, order where disorder had been accepted, control where improvisation had become the norm. But this success came with an unintended effect. It revealed dependency. Campaign after campaign, the same pattern emerged. When Belisarius was in command, outcomes were predictable. Cities held, armies stayed disciplined, negotiations ended cleanly. When he was not, uncertainty returned. This did not look like a crisis. It looked like a comparison. And comparisons are dangerous for systems built on hierarchy. Because hierarchy depends on the idea that roles matter more than people. That authority comes from position, not performance. That anyone placed into the structure should produce roughly the same result. Belisarius disproved that assumption, not by claiming superiority, but by demonstrating it. The more reliable he became, the more visible the gap grew between him and others. And the more visible that gap became, the more uncomfortable the court grew. Success began to change how he was treated. Messages from Constantinople became more formal, instructions more detailed, praise more restrained. Victories were acknowledged, but without warmth. No one said this openly. There were no accusations, no warnings, just adjustments. Belisarius was given narrower mandates, shorter timelines, clearer limits. He was no longer sent to resolve open-ended problems. He was sent to manage contained ones. This was not punishment. It was management. The empire was trying to reduce risk, because reliance concentrates power, even when no one intends it to. Officials began asking questions they had not needed to ask before. What would happen if Belisarius failed? What would happen if he refused an order? What would happen if he was removed? The fact that these questions could be asked at all was the issue. In healthy systems, individuals are replaceable. In fragile ones, they are not. And when a system realizes that someone may be irreplaceable, it does not reward them. It contains them. Belisarius remained loyal. He followed orders exactly as before. He did not protest limitations. He did not attempt to renegotiate authority. He accepted boundaries as part of service. From his perspective, nothing fundamental had changed. From the empire's perspective, everything had. Because success had crossed an invisible threshold. It was no longer just useful, it was disruptive. Belisarius had become a proof of concept the empire did not want to acknowledge. That competence was unevenly distributed. That effectiveness could not be standardized. That the system's stability relied on exceptions. And exceptions are dangerous, not because they rebel, but because they expose the limits of control. The empire did not move against Belisarius. It did something more subtle. It began preparing for a future in which he would no longer be central. Assignments became rotational. Responsibilities were divided. Decision-making was fragmented, not to weaken him directly, but to weaken dependence on him. This was rational, measured, reasonable, and once begun, it was irreversible. Belisarius continued to win, but each victory now carried a different meaning. It no longer strengthened his position, it confirmed the empire's fear. That success, when concentrated too long in one person, stops being a solution and becomes a liability. The decision did not arrive as a betrayal. It arrived as a correction. There was no single decree announcing a change in Belisarius's fate. No dramatic reversal. No moment where loyalty was questioned or accusations were made. Instead, the empire adjusted procedures. Commands were divided. Authority was shared. Campaigns were planned so that no outcome depended entirely on one man. On paper, this made sense. From the perspective of administration, it was prudent. From the perspective of risk management, it was necessary. No empire could afford to hinge its survival on an individual, no matter how capable. The problem was not the logic, it was the timing. Belisarius was still winning. The threats had not disappeared. Stability was fragile, and yet the system began acting as if the greater danger was not external enemies but internal dependence. This reframing changed everything. Belisarius was no longer evaluated primarily on results. He was evaluated on predictability, on compliance, on how neatly he fit into a structure that was now being reinforced around him. His autonomy narrowed, not sharply, gradually. Orders arrived with more conditions. Decisions required more approval. Flexibility was replaced with procedure. None of this was framed as distrust. It was framed as standardization. The empire was trying to ensure continuity, to prove that success could be institutionalized, that outcomes could be reproduced without relying on exceptional individuals. This is a common instinct in large systems. When confronted with excellence they cannot replicate, they attempt to dilute it, not to destroy it, but to make it manageable. Belisarius accepted these changes without protest. He followed revised protocols. He shared authority. He deferred where previously he had acted decisively. From the outside, he appeared unchanged. From the inside, his role was being redefined. He was no longer the solution. He was becoming a component, and components can be replaced. The empire believed this transition would be invisible, that by the time any weakness emerged, the system would already have adapted. What it underestimated was how much of its recent stability had depended not on structure, but on judgment, not on procedure, but on discretion. Belisarius had provided that quietly, without fanfare, without claiming credit. As his influence was reduced, nothing collapsed immediately. There were no disasters, no sudden failures, just a subtle increase in friction. Decisions took longer. Responses were less coherent. Opportunities were missed, not catastrophically, but consistently. These were not signs of collapse. They were signs of adjustment, the kind that feels responsible, the kind that reassures those in control, the kind that seems reasonable right up until the moment its consequences become irreversible. By the time the empire noticed what it had lost, the process was already complete, and reversing it would have meant admitting that the system had been wrong. That was a concession it was not prepared to make. The consequences did not arrive as disaster. They arrived as delay. Nothing collapsed overnight. No city fell in flames. No army was wiped out. From a distance, the empire still appeared functional, but underneath, the texture of decision-making had changed. Without Belisarius's judgment at the center of operations, choices became cautious, not careful, but hesitant. Authority was distributed, but responsibility was not. Plans required consensus. Consensus required time, and time in fragile situations is rarely neutral. Responses slowed, messages circulated longer before action was taken. Commanders deferred decisions they once would have made immediately. Opportunities passed not because they were misunderstood, but because no one felt authorized to seize them. This created a new rhythm, a slower one, and slowness, unlike failure, is difficult to accuse. No single official could be blamed. No policy could be identified as wrong. Each delay was reasonable in isolation, each adjustment defensible, but their accumulation mattered. Where Belisarius had once absorbed uncertainty through judgment, the system now processed it through procedure. That conversion was efficient on paper, but brittle in practice. Small problems grew, not explosively, incrementally. Supply lines stretched longer than planned. Negotiations lost momentum. Local unrest took more time to contain. None of this signaled crisis. It signaled friction. The empire began spending more energy maintaining stability than extending it. Effort shifted from initiative to preservation. This was not incompetence, it was diffusion. Responsibility had been spread so evenly that it no longer concentrated anywhere. Decisions were made, but without ownership. Orders were issued, but without urgency. The system was functioning, but it was no longer adaptive. Belisarius observed this from the margins. He was still consulted, but less often, still respected, but no longer decisive. His role had become advisory, and advisory authority carries no momentum. By the time the empire recognized that outcomes had changed, it was difficult to trace why. Nothing obvious had been removed. No rule had been broken. Only a presence had been diluted, and dilution, once complete, cannot be reversed by decree. The empire did not fall because Belisarius was sidelined, but the margin of safety he had quietly provided was gone, and without that margin, every future decision would matter more, because there would be less room for error, less room for delay, less room for recovery. The system had not collapsed, but it had lost its ability to absorb strain, and that loss would define everything that followed. History rarely records the moment when something is quietly removed. It records outcomes. Belisarius would live long enough to see the empire continue without him at its center. He was not executed, not disgraced, not erased. He was simply made irrelevant, and that is often how systems deal with what they cannot control. The empire did not collapse because it sidelined Belisarius. It survived, it adapted, it endured, but it did so with less margin, less flexibility, less forgiveness for error. What Belisarius represented was not conquest, it was judgment. The ability to decide under pressure, to absorb uncertainty, to act without waiting for permission when delay carried greater risk. When that disappeared, the system still functioned, but it became brittle. History would later remember emperors, wars, borders gained and lost. It would not linger on the quiet recalibration that removed one man from the center of power. And yet, that recalibration mattered, because empires rarely fall from external blows alone. They weaken when competence becomes inconvenient, when effectiveness is treated as risk, when systems choose predictability over judgment. Belisarius did not bring down the empire, but the way the empire responded to him revealed the direction it was already moving, slowly, quietly, toward collapse.